On behalf of the IMM, I'm delighted to officially welcome you to the first event in our 2020 Thought Leadership Online series. My name's Janine Herzig and I'm the President of the IMM. IMM acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we meet today, throughout Australasia and internationally. We recognise their strong connections to land, sea and community. I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Kaurna people of the magnificent Adelaide Plains, and I pay respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to traditional custodians of all of our lands. This is our third Thought Leadership series, but the first time that we are hosting it as an interactive online event, which means we have a truly global audience with us today. I'd especially like to welcome all our IMM members, as well as those of you who are joining us for the first time on one of our online events, and for the many of you who are joining us outside of normal hours. We are absolutely thrilled to be able to bring people together from all over the world to hear an exciting future vision for the mining sector. Over these next few weeks, we'll explore emerging trends, and in a time of great uncertainty, we will look at how we can shape our collective future. Each session will have dedicated time for you to pose questions to our expert speakers, and we encourage everyone to be part of these discussions. For those of you who don't know much about the IMM, we are the peak body leading the way for the tens of thousands of people who work in the resources sector. We provide exceptional professional development opportunities, including world-class technical conferences, leadership events, courses, scholarships, mentoring, and online learning. Our renowned membership and chartered professional programs provide recognition to our more than 13,000 members who are committed to the highest industry standards. As the trusted voice for people in resources, the IMM advocates on behalf of our people and advances policy for the benefit of our communities. We proudly represent a global network of professionals, connecting people who have or who are building a career in resources and who care deeply about their industry and the broader community. This connection is even more critical when many of us are not able to meet face to face. And this sense of belonging is something that I have personally valued for the past 30 years of my IMM membership. We're so proud that through our Thought Leadership Online series, we can connect our global community and hear from world-leading experts. Together, we'll investigate the new frontiers in mining and the many exciting opportunities for our sector. Today, we'll be kicking off our series with a fireside chat with PwC Australia's Chris Dodd. Our MC, Kat Matson, will formally introduce Chris in just a moment. Chris is going to set the scene for the entire series, exploring emerging trends, including the impact COVID-19 is having on our sector, and the way we are showing leadership and resilience in a time of global disruption. I'm really looking forward to Chris's expert insights. Chris has been a great supporter of the IMM for many years now. And this chat will give us a chance to think about the role that we all play as resources professionals in leading the economic recovery for our communities. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our series partners. We are so proud to partner with leading organisations who share the same values and recognise the importance of professionals in shaping the future of the resources sector. Thank you to our signature partner, PwC, our major partners, Dassault Systèmes, Metz Ignited, and Rio Tinto, and all of our series and supporting partners. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Kat. Kat's a fantastic and popular MC who's known for her authentic style and bringing the best out of her speakers. We're really thrilled that we can have Kat bring her focused expertise to our Thought Leadership series. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Janine, and welcome everyone. I think it's quite extraordinary that we can do this event virtually. And as Janine was saying, you know, this is the third Thought Leadership series. Normally, we're restricted by physical location, but now, because we're all online, we can reach so many people. So before I introduce, or as I introduce Chris, I should say, I would love to know where everyone is from. So please just use the blue hand that you can see. Once you click on that blue hand, that's basically like raising your hand, and say hello in the native language from wherever you're watching from, and let us know where you are watching from, because I'd love to get a sense of just how global this audience is. Now, Chris, we're going to have an awesome conversation today. Hello. Now, look, everyone can see that you're the partner of Assurance Mining and Australia's Future Prosperity. That's a big title. I want to know, though, yeah, it is. It's pretty awesome. I want to know, though, Chris, what's something that you would like us to know about you that perhaps we wouldn't find if we did a Google search about you? You know, like let's make it a little bit human first, huh?
Righto. Well, a contemporary one would certainly be what you just described. I've never spoken to 1,000 people while looking at the rooftop of my neighbour, so that's new. I think anyone could Google that I was the father of 5 daughters, but I'm not sure they could find a photo of the 5 birthday cakes I made for each of them for each of their first 5 birthdays. So how about that as a bit of a starter for 10?
Now, that's pretty epic, Chris. And, I mean, in Australia, we have the Australian Women's Weekly birthday cake book, and it's an icon. And, in fact, it turns 30 this week. Did you make the birthday cakes out of that book?
So my childhood memory is one of life's great joys was the month leading up to your birthday, going through that book 1,000 times to work out whether you'd have the dump truck or the pool with the jelly or whatever. So that's what I tried to instill in my kids, that they had enjoy the month of going through all of that. So yeah, it's always been a bit of fun. Now that they're teenagers, it's not so cool for Dad to make the cake.
That is pretty epic. For those who aren't familiar with the Australian Women's Weekly cookbook, it is an Australian icon. And Chris, your childhood memory is exactly the same as mine. And in fact, I was lucky enough to inherit my mum's copy of the book. So it still has all of the bookmarks in it from all of the cakes that I wanted to make 40 odd years ago. So look, now that we've put a bit of humanity into it, you've been with PwC now for 30 years, which is quite an impressive career journey. And as partner, you must have worked across many industries. What is it that draws you to the mining sector?
So I reckon mining came up pretty early in those 30 years. I mean, from my perspective, it's probably focused on the finances of mining, but I think that there's something about the scale of the industry, whether it's just getting out to site and just appreciating the vastness of a place you might get to, or the size of the machinery, the human endeavour to understand the geology into how would you get that stuff out of the ground, into what would you do with it, the sort of chemistry that's going on at the same time. It's just, it always fascinated me as it sort of unfolded. And so I can remember looking at a lot of processing plants and thinking, there's someone out there who actually knows what all of this stuff does. And probably some of them are on this call today. So I'll find that part intimidating. But, you know, the thing that's grown on me over the 30 years is just how much impact it has across the world. You know, if you don't grow it, you mine it. It's a pretty important part of everything we do every day. So, yeah, a real passion play.
Yeah, really nice. Now, PwC's just released the Global Mine Report. So it's the PwC Global Mine Report. It's now in its 17th year, and its title this year was Resilient and Resourceful. Resourceful, that's a cute play on words, but resilient, I think, is extraordinarily key in the current context. So within that theme, what can those people watching around the world who are working in that sector, what are the key highlights that you want people to take away from that report?
So just a little history lesson in those 17 years. That the idea of this was to take the 40 biggest listed mining companies on the planet and add them all together as if they were a single entity, and just see what it told us about the industry. So that group of 40 companies actually represents about 50% of the global industry. So it's a pretty good snapshot of what are the trends going on through the whole industry. In fact, of those 40, the top 5 make up 50% of that 50%. So it's an amazing industry for the scale of some of the organisations in it. But when you do add all of those together, we use 31 December as our cutoff. So we've got a whole year, calendar year 2019. We add them all together. And right about 31 December 2019, someone said there was something going on in Wuhan. By the time we started pulling the information together in March, April, all hell was breaking loose in a lot of ways, and we didn't really know where it was going to go, and ports were closing, and what was this going to mean? And here we are a bit further on, and actually, I think the resilience has actually held as a story all the way through that. In a lot of ways, the importance of the industry came to the fore, that nearly every country has managed to keep its industry operating pretty successfully right through. Now, we have got this benefit of remoteness that happens to be a sort of endemic part of the industry. So that definitely helped that you had that remoteness happening. There's no doubt there's been areas impacted really badly, and once it did get into a community, the chances that would impact a particular operation was pretty high. But whereas maybe in February, March, the risk was what happens if ports close and no one can get out of their houses and fly-in, fly-outs off, and people can't move on aeroplanes and all those sorts of. What happens with a really integrated supply chain of how you move this product across the world? What happens if that all stops? It's not, the industry's not actually designed to stop. It's a perpetual motion sort of system. So to actually see that in March, April, May, and even right up until now, to see that's been able to be restored, I think has been really fascinating. But it's also flushed out a number of things that I think we've all taken as a given on the way through as we've developed the industry. We've thought about how we might do things smarter and better. We've streamlined supply chains, so we're more reliant on one location than we ever were. We're more reliant on being able to move key talent to the right spot when we need them. What happens when all of those bets stop? What do you do? And so that's part of what the report's flushing out.
I think that's really interesting. I'm going to come to that in a second. I want to acknowledge that we've got heaps of people saying hello and g'day from Australia. Nice work. Far more hellos from Australia, actually, than I was expecting. Where's our g'days? We've received a namaste from India. Thank you. Scrolling through, there's people all over. I just think it's so cool. So thank you. And please pop your questions in to that same question box. Just raise your hand to ask a question. I am going to keep talking with Chris for a while before I come back to your questions, but we are seeing them all, and so we will do our best to get there. Now, Chris, you just mentioned that, our supply chains have become so dependent on moving things around the world, moving things around our countries, getting key personnel or key talent to locations. What has the impact of COVID-19 been on both those, I'm going to say operations, but also on commodity prices?
Yeah, righto. So in terms of operations, this has probably been more demand impact than supply impact. Supply has actually been able to stay, again, that word will keep coming up, but it's been pretty resilient all the way through. Where it started to be a concern as things like the Chinese ports closed down for a period of time. What was going to happen if we couldn't unload ships? What happens at the ship you're loading somewhere in the local country of origin? What about the train that was arriving at that port, etc.? So that sort of knock-on effect was a concern. But on the demand side, you've really seen what happens if countries are unable to continue with these lockdowns, hit longer and play harder. And so really interesting for this industry is the speed at which China came back out of what could have been, almost calamitous in that, given Wuhan was the epicenter. It's really almost business as usual for a lot of our product around the world that finds its way into China, and that basically insatiable demand for what it takes to urbanize a billion people or more. Is continuing on. The need for infrastructure is still there. There's actually, if anything, some stimulus packages starting to generate more of that. So actually prices have stayed pretty resilient. There's a lot in prices. So, there's global uncertainties that are playing out a little bit more. We saw a flight to gold early that then almost flipped on its head. And if you can explain to me why there's now a flight to stock markets rather than gold, I think even the smartest of folks are struggling to explain that just at the moment. But yeah, there's definitely some challenges about where those assumptions were about the supply chain and where things went. But the commodities themselves have actually stayed pretty resilient price-wise and volume-wise.
Yeah, that's good. Also, I just want to say selamat siang to Jeffrey, who's participating from Jakarta in Indonesia. And yes, that's me showing off because it's the only language that I have any minimal grasp of. And to Lucy, who says that she missed the name of the report. It's PwC's Global Mine Report 2020. Is that correct, Chris? I've got the words on that right?
Google mine with an asterisk and you'll find it. Yep.
On top of the supply chain challenges, Chris, we're seeing a more polarised geopolitical outlook. Look, I'm not going to ask you any leading questions. What do you think the impacts of that are on the industry, on mining?
Yeah, it really permeates through a lot of the issues that we're thinking about. So at a really fundamental level, if the US-China relations was to sour in a particular direction and China wanted to take action against any of the US allies, or it wanted to flex its muscle around the globe, we probably in this report would have 50% of all production, if not more, feeding into the Chinese economy. So it's hugely important to all of us that we understand how stable that is. What will it mean geopolitically? It does feel like there's a bit of muscle flexing going on, and I think in a couple of the trade moves recently, I think China's indicating we understand how important we are to a lot of your suppliers. We could play some games here that would be pretty fundamental. So one of the places that we call it in the report is the industry's issues or attitudes to cyber. And so a lot of mining executives would say that they don't feel overly concerned about cyber. Well, I think when you put a geopolitical overlay on it and you now know you have state actors playing in that space and perhaps wanting to disrupt in a way that was less than friendly, let's say, a major industry like this with a need to be mobile and logistically aligned every hour to make things work looks very vulnerable if you're not careful. So I think if you add these things together, it's not like any one of them in isolation is the problem, but you want to start thinking about the interdependencies, which again is sort of what COVID flushed out for us. Where do those interdependencies really change how it all works together?
I want to pick up your comments around cyber. In my past life, I was the Chief Digital Officer for Brisbane, and we often had this conversation around the importance of cyber, and it was often dismissed. It's kind of like, it doesn't really matter. Can you talk a bit more into that? And I think in the context of this conversation, what do people need to be looking for when it comes to, what do people need to be thinking about at a really meta level when it comes to cyber and mining? And I'm going to finish it there because I've lost my train of thought. Yeah. What do we need to think about in the cybersecurity space?
Yeah, so I know there's actually a whole one of this series will be addressing cyber completely. So I won't pretend to step into the zones that Fergus can go into. But I think at a really relatively simple level, have a think about what are the key assets you have that have some level of data or digitization to them. So in a mining context, what is that sales and marketing information? Where is it available? Does it need to be available on the cloud? Is there something there that you really wouldn't like state players to get their hands on? Would that influence how you were able to sell product? You're doing a great job as an industry thinking through how we automate, how do we use cloud, how do we use remote working and remote centers to help run our operations. All of that's going through the world of cyber at some point in time. Now, we call it cyber. It sort of boils down to some pretty basic housekeeping about how well do you do the patching over your system, how much do you understand about where each sensor around the site that's sending information back through the cloud and into your office. You know, where did that drone get made that you're doing your surveys with? All of these things sort of play together, and it's like it's not quite as simple as we maybe switch it off and switch it on again, which might have been our old IT approach.
Well, and it's like who can look in our windows? Who can peer in and see what we're doing without us necessarily being able to see them back?
And I think just on the peering in windows, you also know now that people are coming inside the windows and they can actually sit in the corner of your house for days, weeks, months and years without you knowing that they're there. So it's not just that can you keep them in or out? There's actually, they're in. And so what are they doing while they're in and how would they go?
Yep, absolutely. I know we've got a lot of Australians on the call and a few in other regions. Can you just explain for the Aussie audience, how are companies with emerging market assets and operations, so for example, Africa, South America, Asia, how are they handling the workforce challenges in general as well as with the COVID overlay?
I think individual operations have always got a really good handle on the sort of locations that they're operating in. They'll understand their communities well. They'll understand the government regulations and how they go. I think, though, we've noticed, and even this is before COVID hit, in fact, one of the things we talk about in the report, the fragility of that social right to operate. We certainly saw in South America a number of protests and other unrest that really influenced production activities, and this wasn't just pitchforks at the mine gate. This was walking the streets of capital cities in Santiago, and people really feeling like they weren't getting a fair share of what the industry can produce. So I think there's this. The ability for information to move so much more freely means people understand what's going on. They understand where wealth is being transferred. They want to understand that they're being looked after, I think is probably the way to frame it up. One of the things we'd say again in the report is that the resilience of companies to sort of look after their shareholders, their bankers, their workers, their communities is getting a lot better. You can actually see the balance playing out a lot better. But how it interacts, particularly in those countries that you're talking about, is a hand-to-hand combat sort of issue, which there's no generic answer to how that plays out. If there was one challenge in COVID, I think the overarching rule of how people dealt with that is they flew expertise in that wasn't available locally. So, you mentioned Australia at the start. One of Australia's great mining exports is the expertise that we have and the ability to go into any country around the world. That's really changed. That's really difficult again. The act of quarantining, the visa restrictions, are you allowed in the country? Are you allowed back in? All of those sorts of things play out. So are we as nimble and mobile? Could we use this sort of technology to how we bring our expertise in on site? Back to the very first question, the scale of this organisation and kicking the rocks on the ground is still a pretty important part of what we do. And so it's not like it's an either or here. We've got to find a way for both of those things to balance. There's some complexity in there too, Kat.
Yeah, it's a complex world, really, isn't it, Chris?
If anyone's on the call looking for a panacea to all of this, I'm sorry, that's not what we're going to land on.
Well, and it's funny. I mean, this is the thought leadership series. It's not the how to do your job in an XYZ context. And one of the interesting nuances about thought leadership is often we create more questions than we answer. Lucky I'm quite comfortable with ambiguity, and I'm assuming that you're the same, Chris. But I think that's actually one of the very interesting discoveries, if you like, that we've had throughout this COVID scenario. The world is far more ambiguous than perhaps we previously gave it credit for, and we actually have to be far more nimble and far more flexible in our thinking.
Yeah. There was a great Al Gore quote, I think, in the Inconvenient Truth, where he was quoting someone else, I can't remember too, but he said, it's not the things you don't know that are dangerous, it's the things you know for sure that just ain't so. And this COVID's flushed that out a lot.
That's a ripper of a quote. Just a reminder to the audience that if you do have any technical issues, like if the screen freezes, if the sound freezes, your best bet is to just refresh your web browser. You will come back in and it will be fine. And also a reminder that we will be going to audience questions very soon. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, pop it into the chat box, and they are being fed through to me so I can see them. Before we do that though, What is the report, the Global Mine Report by PwC? What does that report tell us, Chris, about the outlook for commodities post-COVID-19, whenever post-COVID-19 is?
Right. It says we don't know when post-COVID-19 is. That's probably a truism. But what the forecast sort of talks about is a drop of about 6% for the year ahead. So that's a pretty modest impact when you think of the global turmoil that's going on. That largely reflects how resilient the industry has looked. There's actually, we're not a million miles away from the same height as the first boom that people talk about, the biggest boom in our lifetime. This is actually a really successful era for the industry, and it's actually happening with a bit more balance this time around. There's not a crazy rush to more supply for a couple of reasons, but this is sort of now a bit more of a status quo, feeling fairly stable. The uncertainties, I think, the fragility of that social right to operate really plays out when you start looking at what's the forecast for coal, what's the forecast for some of our energy-rich commodities, where will they necessarily go? We can talk a little later, but the sort of mandate changing of major investment organisations who don't want to step into certain parts of the industry going forward, or even putting some blankets over the entire industry, even though they're talking about a particular issue. They're the sort of things in the forecast that are a real unknown. They're a real major potential impact on what we're forecasting, and yet no real way of knowing how that might play out. Having said all of that, the core fundamentals are that supply is remaining strong, and the challenges on supply are that, as we've talked about for 10 and 15 years, supply is getting deeper and harder to get at, and in harder to get at locations. So it's very hard to meet the demand of a growing world. Energy demand is going up, infrastructure demand is going up. So it's largely expected the COVID impact is somewhat temporary in the scheme of mining. So if over 100 years you'll be able to see COVID as a little blip, we hope. But it's certainly a relatively temporary thing from a forecasting perspective. So I would say expect more and better going forward. And if not 2020, then probably 2021, you'd be right back on track with some good management.
Thank you. You touched on it, so I'm going to ask it because it was also mentioned by an audience member as well. Are we seeing different impacts across different commodities? So, for example, coal. Can we just dig into that? And my apologies if I missed you articulating that. I was multitasking across questions.
No, well played. And I really like to dig into that. I see what you did there. That was clever. Look, the commodities that impact this survey the most at the moment are obviously iron ore, and the story of iron ore has been very strong. That's steel, infrastructure, building cities. That's where that's going. And a lot of metallurgical coal, which is another large part of the coal need, goes into that same spot. Now, I'm talking to the AusIMM audience. There's a lot of people who know exactly, or more than I need to know about all of that sort of thing. But then you get into the base metals, and so finding copper is continuing to be somewhat of a challenge, particularly at scale. But the demand for the coppers and the zincs, and what happens as we increase the technology right through the economy, means that mobile phones need more of it, the Wi-Fi capability needs more of it, the ability to work remotely will require some of these things to happen. Then you move into some of the newer minerals. That obviously the minerals are just as old, but the things that are moving up in demand that do go more into modern lifestyle are where we're seeing demand. So the flip is, what are you seeing with coal? What are you seeing with uranium? Those that gain a lot of attention from an industry point of view. We're still seeing demand and growth in coal. We've seen the majors largely step out, but they've stepped out by selling. They haven't stepped out by closing. So now you've got a new owner who needs to get their money back. And the way capitalism has worked for a long time is that means that coal is going to be on market for a long time yet. Major expansion companies in countries like Indonesia that you spoke of before have a plan that includes at least a third of their islands being powered by coal, whereas they can use renewables and other things in other locations. It's a very valuable source of power, and one of the best ways to bring your citizens into a more modern sort of lifestyle. How do we manage that with the social right to operate is a really big challenge, and we're getting better at it. The transition is happening, but the transition is going to take a long time, and these sort of changes in investment mandates are the start of what causes change in an industry over time.
Oh my gosh, I could go off on so many different tangents there.
There's a lot in there.
I won't. There is a lot, and I personally want to know more about how do we drive investment mandates that work for all, but I won't, because that's not the focus of this conversation. No. We do have
an audience. We do have to.
We really do. But yeah, look, that's probably a little bit philosophical for now, so we might leave it. Chris, we do have an audience question. I'm going to read it as it's come through because I'm not the content expert here. Midterm, do you expect the role of China in the supply chain might change? Could China be replaced by other markets like India? Or could Europe come back in midterm as a market of international ore supplies?
So I believe the first response to all of these is great question. So I'll do that. It was a great question.
You'd make a great politician, Chris.
The learning, I think, for a lot of supply chains is this whole, basic methodology of don't have all your eggs in one basket has been breached by so many parts of the industry to say, look, we are too dependent in one location. The role of India, the role of Indonesia, the role of Europe, I think a lot of supply will look to diversify where it goes to. The sheer scale of China fundamentally stops that from happening, though, because when China's growing at 6 and 8%, you're talking about a really seismic shift in the amount of product that has to be provided, and so it's a powerful player. It's in perhaps everyone else's interest to find a little diversification in that. But equally, China is going to flex its muscle to make sure that it gets what it needs for the development that it's promised to its people. And so I think there's a real tug of war about what that midterm might look like, because I don't think China's just going to let Europe take a new source of supply if that's where they want to go. You see long-term deals being signed up. They're not silly. They're signing up African countries. They're signing up major projects around the globe to make sure that they've got security of supply coming in. So yeah. I apologise. I'm saying they like it's a foreign body. I believe China is a really important part of our industry. But there's games at play here that people will well alert to, and one thing you can be sure of is China plays the midterm and long-term game possibly better than anyone else on the table.
Yep, I think that's the valid point. That view to the mid and long term is part of the competitive advantage, not just, in addition and on top of their sheer volume. Yep. A question has come through from Adrian. Thank you, by the way, everyone, for your questions. Please keep them coming in, because I've got heaps, but really this is your webinar, so please keep the questions coming in. So this question is from Adrian, and Chris, basically Adrian saying, what are your thoughts on the technology capability in the sector, the importance of its contribution, both size and impact, to the future resilience and ongoing sustainability of the mining sector? So what are your thoughts on technology capability in the sector?
So we call out technology in the report specifically for it's hard to isolate the impact of technology as you're looking through something like a year of mining. But what you can see is that the amount of spend going into what we would call technology is clearly there. The announcements about where companies have been able to create levels of remote working, reducing the number of people required underground, the use of driverless technologies, those types of things. There's plenty of good examples of where it's happening. I think the need for this industry to constantly reinvent itself has always been there. We can probably see that we talk about the FANG company, so you're talking about Facebook and Netflix and the like. Mining hasn't faced technology the way they have because they've sort of started markets as if they're new. And so the movie sharing market was able to be sort of Netflix's domain. what we've actually seen, where you've got something like the interaction between a mining house and Caterpillar as you introduce driverless technology or better technology in trucking, is that the value share mechanism is very hard to negotiate, because the inventor of the new truck would like to get 80% of the saving that they believe that they have created with the technology. The mine would like to capture 80% of that value for the fact that they own the commodity, or they control the commodity that's going to drive the value. And so the industry actually hasn't dealt with that value sharing very well yet. And I think that's what's getting in the way of the implementation of new technology. So it's a really interesting thing for a established and well-established and almost traditional industry to face into the disruption of technology without letting go of some of the things that you hold dear. It might be that these investors and these societies will actually create the change that we need to have, because the parties at the front of the table can't get the agreement that they need. So it's, again, this sort of intertwined nature of where will technology go. It has to be where we go. And what we've seen with COVID is the ability to innovate and find different ways of getting things done has moved forward amazingly in 6 months by comparison of what I think everyone on this call would know. There was things we're doing today that 6 months ago we said were impossible. You couldn't possibly run a mine like that. And we've just learned you have to, because we couldn't leave our house. And so those sort of needs for innovation have been really important, and I think we've got to capture that learning where we can.
Nothing drives innovation better than necessity. That's all there is to it.
Yep.
I've got a workforce-related question now from Sheng. Chris, what are your thoughts about the impact of the skills shortage in the resources industry?
Oh, so this one fits perfectly in, but it fits perfectly into the social right to operate. And what we talk about a little bit about brand mining, and I know AusAMM talks about it a bit, where have we maintained our seat at the table for being a valid industry, being a place that people want to come and work? So the skills shortage is not so much that the skills aren't there, it's the skills are choosing to not work here. The skills exist, but they're choosing to. If I had a choice of working at the Googleplex or in the Pilbara, I think that I've got a lot of people choosing I might work in Silicon Valley. And that comes from the fact that at school, they're hearing that this is a bad place to be, or they're not necessarily hearing of it as a place to be. And then they go home and their parents are now saying, I'm not sure you want to go into that industry. So you've got to talk to granddad or grandma who says, oh, you need to understand mining. It's a really important part of our economy. So this issue about brand mining is the skill shortage, and drawing the things together. It's not new training programs, and there's lots of things we will do to get the training in place. And so the dedicated people on these sorts of webcasts, we can build their skills, but we've got to find ways to attract that new group of people. Remote working, the ability to work from your home, some of those things might actually allow us to get some of the. I've always thought that Nintendo gamers might be our best mine drivers once we're driverless trucks. They could run 12 and 18 trucks at a time. So I don't have the answer. I wish I did, Kat, but it's a really interesting thing about what we do in that skill shortage. It's not just training up people, which I think it gets talked about a bit as a bit of a simplification of the problem. I think
it's a really interesting perspective. I'd never thought about the fact that the skill shortage is actually not a true skill shortage. It's a desire barrier. People don't want to work in the industry. And in terms of Nintendo players, there is a fascinating series of studies done by a woman called Jane McConical, who actually argues that gamers, true online gamers, would actually be the best problem solvers in the world. And if we could just tap into them and put the big epic challenges to them, or the epic problems to them, or the wicked challenges, they would be able to solve them, because they're used to having to push through. They're used to having to form flexible working groups and teams.
Yep.
And so Jane McGonigal, if you wanted to check that out.
Two things that the industry does have. One I spoke about at the start, this thing about scale and big trucks and the fact that you would actually be doing something as distinct from playing something, coding something, is an attractiveness that we could think about how we get people motivated. The other thing, the new currency is cool problems. show me you've got a cool problem and let me solve it for you. What could these kids do with the data we've got in geology if you just thought about it fundamentally differently? Where could this go? So again, this industry has been great in this space for 100 years. So we can embrace what these cool problems could look like. But how do you reframe it that it's not the high vis and the hard hat that's attractive, but it's the coolness of the problem? Is that where we need to go?
Yeah, and repositioning that as a problem to be solved, not a problem with a predetermined solution space. Like, yeah, quite literally look outside the box. All right, coming back to audience questions. So I've got a question from Joe. Despite the mining industry being an early of automation, today only about 3% of all mobile equipment is truly autonomous, and most of that is haulage. Do you see that this might change as a result of the pandemic?
So I think it must. I think the pandemic is flushing out where we could have gone further than we have. I think it's opened people's minds to how much more automation is possible. The thing I talked about a little earlier, I do think is a real problem about the value exchange. Who gets the value of that change when it happens? Why does our industry own the trucks? They're not actually fundamental to what we do. Do we need to rethink about what the Uber of mining looks like? Which bits of it do we actually need to be the owner of? Because it's a capital-intensive industry, but others might be better at owning it than we are. Now you're starting to give up control of the cool toys, and the people who are in charge of deciding that have been in charge of the cool toys for a long time. So it's the ability to think quite differently about where to next for technology actually calls on all of us to think differently. I think the reason the question flags COVID as potentially being that little trigger to get to that different way of thinking. And I do have some hope that might be where it goes.
There has been a running joke in the technical slash digital space that apparently all we needed for a digital transformation that we've all been driving now for a good, decade plus is a pandemic. Who knew?
There you go.
I've got a question from Marcel. His question is, has lithium missed the boat already, and will it be overtaken by other battery metals?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one from the perspective of our report, because when you're picking up the top 40 companies on the planet, lithium is very poorly represented. It's just not at the scale that it has been. So there's a couple of players. The report doesn't really get into whether or not it's missed the boat. So I won't go too far into that, because I don't think we've really delved that specifically. But rather than focus on who wins and who loses on the battery technology, I think battery technology is the opportunity to modernise the view of our industry. I think it's the opportunity to say, hey, we're a crucial part of the future, not just a crucial part of the past. And that's going to be, how could we be part of the scale of batteries, the scale of what does renewable stored energy look like, and how could that play out? It's actually a story that would appeal to that same group of people who've just walked away from us, right? So there's something in there. Honestly, in fairness to my questioner, I don't know the answer on whether lithium's missed the boat. I think it's probably a fair challenge. We see a lot of people who fly in and out of this report because they're the star of the show from a market cap point of view for a year or two, and they just don't stay there for any length of time. The thing we do notice is being the star of the show and the cool new thing on the block, and you get this market cap rise because everyone wants to be in lithium. Then you get to the practical realities and the physical part of this industry where you've actually got to produce stuff, get it on boats, get it on ships, get it sold at the scale and quality that's required, is a completely different skill set than being the cool commodity. And so that's the other thing I probably would call out as we're trying to find the next winner. I know when you're betting on the stock market, finding the next winner is really important, but the industry needs to latch onto that story. Yeah.
I mean, mining and resources is an essential. It's an essential part of life. Certainly, sure, there's a role for the shiny new kid on the block, but there's obviously always going to be a massive role for the old guard.
Yep. Animal, mineral, vegetable, I think is the game, isn't it? Yeah, one of those three.
Now, on that tone, I've got a question from Jeffrey, and it's around the exploration side of the industry. How do you see mineral exploration investment improving this year? Is there any evidence of global resource nationalism taking a back seat in order to stimulate investment post-COVID-19?
Wow, that's a well-structured question. So let's pick up nationalism first. Nationalism is impacting to the negative, not to the positive, because it's definitely stop touching my stuff rather than shared information, come and help us exploit our resources, or, unfortunately exploit's the word we use. But yeah, people are being very nationalistic about their resource. We can see in the report a growth in exploration. So that's a positive, and that's actually probably of the 17 years, the first 12, we were seeing exploration plummeting. It was really dropping away. What you are seeing is a de-risking of exploration such that it's a lot more near mine and what the people on the call would call brownfield exploration. So you're looking close to your current resources. How could you extend them? How could you use the existing capital to access things that might be there? So less being spent on the genuine greenfield, and we haven't seen that many genuine greenfield finds, as everyone on the call would know. They're not non-existent, but they're hard. And so it's a really interesting balance between the nationalistic and the what might we all need for that sort of big greenfield find. Without knowing the answer, the most successful countries have either opened the data up to allow people in for a period of time, and there's some great success on that, or the age-old example out of Canada, where we've actually effectively created credits for exploration spend to try and encourage more of it, and that certainly happened. The unfortunate thing that happened to Canada, Kat, in the last 2 or 3 years, and I don't know how many Canadians said hi on the call, but marijuana has disrupted the exploration market. Now, that might seem silly, but the growth in legalized marijuana and the interest in that as a space for capital has meant that exploration's all but dried up as an issue in Canada, and that's the reality of competing for capital. It's not like people have a choice between greenfield and brownfield exploration. They have a choice of Netflix and Amazon and marijuana, as it turns out, and it's actually having a really big impact.
I thought you were going to say that it was the exploration in other commodities has gone up in smoke, but that was obviously too corny a pun.
I guess we could all just chill out about that, couldn't we?
We could. Now, the time has flown, which it always does in thought leadership conversations. So I have 2 more questions that I'm going to ask.
Okay.
We have talked about COVID a lot. So this is a COVID preempted question, but it's not actually about COVID. It's flooded our focus, of course. So what is it that we've collectively taken our focus away from while we've been addressing COVID?
Okay. I love the premise of that question because I think it's exactly right. And we were kind of conscious of that pulling the report together. You could have COVID on every page of the report, or you could call out COVID and say, okay, outside of COVID, what do we need to focus on? We've talked about them a little bit on our way through, but I think that social right to operate, into what it's meaning for investment mandates, into how we report as an industry around ESG type issues, environment and safety, etc., is an area that we have still not really grappled with. We're conscious of it, but we're not good at it. Of the 40 companies, no one reports on it consistently. We can't give you a view of ESG across the 40 companies because they all report it differently. That means you can't control the narrative. That means you can't tell your story as an industry of how you are trying to move into that new world and think of it. I think every person involved in the industry has kids and grandkids that they want to set up for a future. It's not like, people don't want the solution to this to work out. So I think that's the area that has really paid the price. And it's not just through COVID. We'd be kidding ourselves if we blame COVID for losing our direction on that. We have to fundamentally be willing to change how we're approaching that, be consistent in our story, have some sort of mechanisms, the same as we do for reserves and resources, to talk about our impact, to talk about how we're trying to improve it. And importantly, I think to talk about how some of the products we're producing actually go into the solutions that the world is going to need. I don't feel that story is being told well. I commend the attempts we've started to make around that. I think the Minerals Council, for example, is trying to sell that story. I think our challenge, and people on the call can tell me, but we're talking in an echo chamber to ourselves, and no one who we need to listen is listening. And this is how do I get this on Paris Hilton's hat? What do I do to get the Instagram generation talking about this solution? We're miles from that, and we're not, and so we don't control a narrative, and I think that's our single biggest issue.
I love that,
yeah.
And it never ceases to amaze me how the brand of any industry, and I mean, because I get to do these kind of conversations a lot across industries, these conversations are consistent. We often talk about whether it's in digital, mining, defence, it's telling the story outside of our own bubble. And I don't know what the solution is, but it's fascinating to me that it continues to be an issue. So I'm very aware of time, and it is rapidly hurtling towards the hour, and I'm a stickler for keeping to time. I'm just checking to see whether Stephen Durkin, our CEO of AusIMM, is available to do the close. He is. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And Chris, thank you so much for such a generous and engaging conversation. I personally love learning more about the industry, and that has been a very thought-provoking conversation. I particularly appreciate the thoughts around social license to operate. And as we go down our next kind of iteration of remote working, figuring out how we still operate and do what we do, but perhaps remotely, making sure that we actually still maintain a social license to operate in the communities that we are operating in, and that we don't actually further create divides or economic disadvantage, as we figure out that we can use digital to do a whole lot of things. So with that said, thank you very much, Chris, and I'd like to introduce you all to Stephen Durkin, the Chief Executive Officer for AusIMM, to make some closing remarks.
Thanks, Kat. My great pleasure to wrap up today's session and offer a vote of thanks. I'm sure you'd agree it was a brilliant conversation. I think a really great format. I really enjoyed that format. I'd have to say I probably didn't expect it to be quite as entertaining as it was. I think if we had to try and Chris the challenge of getting Paris Hilton and marijuana into a AusIMM presentation, there would have been a good bottle of red wine in it. So it was certainly entertaining, but more importantly, I hope you all learned a lot. I certainly did. I would absolutely commend the PwC report to everybody. From my point of view, it's a report I probably defer to more than any other in terms of understanding what's happening in the industry and some of those future trends that Chris has talked about today. Our Thought Leadership series is all about getting people to think outside the square about our industry and the importance of our industry. And I think today's presentation and discussion with Chris has been a really strong reminder of the complexity of our global industry, especially in a time of worldwide uncertainty. And I think that theme of resilience came through very, very strongly from Chris, and I think it's a really powerful word for our industry. I think for mine, the reflections are really around two areas. One, the constant theme here is the wonderful people that work in our industry. I'm amazed at times when I see the stat that 17% of our total workforce in the resources sector are professionals, tertiary qualified professionals. I think that tells us a lot that this is a sophisticated industry requiring complex solutions, and it's going to be, we feel, the talented people, the people that the AusIMM represents, that are really going to challenge that current way of thinking and find safer, more sustainable and more efficient ways to mine. And I think for mine, it was really that connection to the economy and to communities at large that really came through really strong today. There's no doubt in the eyes of the AusIMM that's going to be the mining industry that will be the key to our economic bounce back post the coronavirus. And I think it's really going to be an opportunity as we look back in time for us as an industry to really recalibrate community understanding as to why and how our industry is so important for Australia. I'd like to once again thank our Thought Leadership Series partners. There's been many, many hundreds of people from all over the world joining in this conversation today. We expect that by the time this series comes to an end, There'll be over 1,000 people from all around the world that will be a part of the series. I would like to thank our signature partner, PwC. PwC continues to be a great supporter of the AusIMM and a great supporter of our industry. We're very appreciative of that. Our major partners, Dassault Systems, Rio Tinto, and Mets Ignited, and all of our series and supporting partners. We do continue our series next Tuesday with a person who's well known to many people, I'm sure, on this forum today. That's Michelle Ash, the Ovia CEO from Dassault Systems. Michelle is going to explore sustainable technology and changing social perceptions of mining. Michelle is an outstanding presenter. I'm looking forward to her insights. I know people will be keen to make the most of this forum and ask us some thought-provoking questions. So we hope to see everyone again next Tuesday. Thank you. Thank you in particular to Chris and Kat. We really, really appreciate your time and commitment to this. Stay safe. Have a good evening. Thank you.